I'm beginning now on the second part of Lecture 2 with 16 qualities of the successful organizer. So we finished with the roles. Now we're talking about qualities of the successful organizer. And these things, as I mentioned in the beginning last week, is that roles of organizers overlap. They're not separate. A lot of these ideas kind of reinforce one another, but it's an interesting way of trying to dissect how organizers evolve and the needs of organizers and the qualities people want to develop. So here he's looking at his own organization, the Strategy Center, and thinking about how it's a theory-driven organization that tries to use theory to plan its actions and then use its actions to develop its theory of change, but that they don't always manage to do that. And that's an important part of thinking about what's needed in organizational development. So he starts with what's the first quality that he would look at in terms of what's important for organizers. So joining an organization based on agreement with its strategy and tactics. He says the more developed and dedicated organizer joins a particular organization because she understands and agrees with its strategy, main tactics, and demands, and believes that the organization can make history. Mann gives an example of working with the Congress of Racial Equality during the Civil Rights Movement and finding out that there really were very important internal splits within the organization. And he rededicated himself to working with CORE and keeping, not trying to split the organization or go with one particular faction, but believing that that organization can really make a difference. And he discusses what the tendencies were, what the different factions were. But having an agreement with the organization itself was really critical for him. Second is building a base and never walks alone. How do you build a base? How do you evaluate your work? He says in any campaign, it's good to have goals and objectives, as well as timetables for when things should get done, and really understanding the multiplier effect. So he says the key to building a base is being able to recruit enough organizers to impact the community so that each person's work generates a multiplier effect. In this process, the success of each organizer becomes cumulative, and then when it reaches a critical mass, begins to be qualitative greater than the community or workplace or bus, and becomes a stronghold for the group. The recruits eventually become organizers themselves. So what does this mean? Really, what he's saying is that when we organize, oftentimes we organize and we think about a task, doing things one-on-one, but we really want to help use the multiplier effect. Again, this is something that's going to be repeated. For an example was Dolores Huerta, and he talks about how she uses the multiplier effect when she worked with Cesar Chavez and Fred Ross in organizing the farm workers. They would have house meetings. They would meet a host, meet a farm worker who was interested in either building power in the community or forming a union or complaining about some of the grievances in the fields. And that host would invite 6 to 8 other people. And those people would hear the presentation, they would get involved, and then they would each host a meeting, or several of them at least would host a meeting. And so they would build the process of using the multiplier effect. So Huerta is quoted in this, and it's very interesting to read her account regarding the building of the farm workers and how she and Caesar emphasized that The power is in your person. You may not have money, you may not speak English, you may not be a citizen, but you have power, and the power is in your person. So building a base and working with others is about empowering people, not only to enlist in the struggle, but to become organizers themselves. So moving on to sings with the choir but finds her own voice. An organizer is like a player in a jazz ensemble, working with the group but expressing an individual voice as well. Without a clear plan and everyone's allegiance to it, an organization can't move forward. But there must be room for originality and, yes, individuality. Otherwise, a rigid organizational culture can kill all creativity and excellence and prevent success. A successful organizer must be adept at negotiating this balance and projecting her own voice while singing with the choir. Once again, civil rights, South Africa, and the Bus Riders Union are the examples. And here he talks about whom we might call evangelists. These are people who were leaders, who's public speakers, who had their own styles and got people riled up and interested in organizing based on their own way of talking to people and their own philosophy. But they all were contributing to social justice struggles. So please take a look at this. There's some very interesting information in this chapter. My notes go into a lot of material here. He says, and forgive my hyphens, sometimes I was copying and pasting from the book. Doesn't mean that's how things are spelled. Mann ends the chapter with this thought about the joy and power of working together and yet expressing oneself. Great organizing has its transcendent moments when the entire organization is in harmony. So being in an organization isn't just working in lockstep. It's finding your voice within an organization, within an event, and within a campaign. So a good listener, number 4, keeps an ear to the ground. Listening is part of learning how to organize. And Mann gives a great account here of the mistakes that he made and also his successes in helping to organize the Trailway bus boycott regarding his listening talents. He talks about hearing people. When he was assigned to be an organizer for CORE, he listened to people's stories of discrimination and injustice constantly, and he would help refer them to the right agency. So I've got some of that in my notes. And then this one individual, Eddie Barnes, called and talked about how his was not an individual case. It wasn't enough just to send him to an agency, but that there was a real struggle in how Black and Puerto Rican porters never would be able to get better jobs, bus drivers or inspectors, etc. And so Mann was really happy that he heard Eddie Barnes' story and hadn't become cynical by listening to so many different complaints. But then Mann became a leader of the boycott and spoke out on TV and was interviewed at press conferences. And he recounts how Joyce Ware, his mentor, explained that while he was very dedicated and he was successful in that, he wasn't being very successful in leading this boycott because he didn't understand what the community was going through, and that it was better for them to bring in someone from a similar community, from Bronx Core, who could speak about why people who had so little would want to sacrifice in order for the group to be able to get ahead. And this really taught Mann that while his heart was in the right place, he just didn't have the grounding, the experience to be able to make the pitch. So that really is worth thinking about, who are our leaders who can really speak to people, and what criteria are necessary. It's necessary to move folks in different situations, and how to weigh a situation and figure out what's required in that situation. And he also said something that I think was very profound. Don't run through stop signs. Don't fail to pause and really understand what's being communicated to you. And he gives an example, which I think is really important. I hope you read it, about trying to recruit workers to join a caucus and not being able to hear their reluctance, and then getting angry with them and getting angry with the people who brought them to this House meeting, and how he really learned, and that his idea, his anger was really out of line, and it was arrogance not to be able to understand what was going on and hear his organizer tell him to, kind of lay off, don't go so fast and try to railroad people. So although you're an organizer and you have things that you want to do and you want to have measurable success, don't run through the stop signs. Very important.